The following lecture is from my Udemy course, Complete 3D Animation Masterclass, Cree Animated Shorts. If you like my teaching style and are interested in taking your skills from intermediate or beginner to advanced 3D artist, consider enrolling in my course. Link in the bio. All right, so now that we've completed our animation here, we're ready to move to the final stretch here and get into rendering. We're going to render this project with Arnold, and we're going to take a look at some of the more advanced rendering features we have access to open up some options in compositing for us. One of those features we're going to take a look at is a feature that has been used for a long time inside of rendering, and this is going to be the idea of render passes. When we talk about render passes, the idea behind render passes is shuffling out the shader information into individual channels that we can manipulate in post-processing. So this would be things such as the color, the specular, the emission, the transmission, and really anything we've put into this shader. We could even shuffle out various things that don't exist, such as ambient occlusion. So there's a lot of really cool things we can make with render passes. Now, inside of Arnold, render passes are referred to as AOVs, which stands for arbitrary output value. And what that's referring to is the mathematics that construct the overall image. So it's arbitrary because it's part of the whole, and it's an output value because it's outputting what the shader has access to. So let's go ahead and get our scene set up for this. The first thing we'll want to do is come up here to our Arnold menu and access our Arnold render view. So we can come up here to Arnold, open Arnold render view, and let's do a quick rendering just to make sure this looks good. And let's find a frame we like. I'm going to move that off screen and just find a nice frame here, an action shot like our grab. That looks really cool. Okay, so I'm going to press the render button here and make sure that my shot cam is set up, and we should see this render. Now, our render should be pretty quick because we set up our render settings in the scene file. We kind of throttled them a little bit so they're not as strong as they could be, but they're strong enough to where we can actually see our rendering in a reasonable amount of time. In addition to that, we have this set to 1280 by 720 thanks to the Play Blast. All right, I wouldn't do 1920 by 1080 till the very end. And don't worry about the graininess right now because we already know we can remove that with render settings later. Now, if you wanted to at this time, you could take some time to adjust the lighting, but I'm going to leave it as is so we can keep this moving forward. Now that we've rendered this, let's access the render settings to set up our basic AOVs. We can access the render settings here, and we're going to want to make a few adjustments to these. Namely, we're going to want to switch back to Arnold. So remember, we swapped to Hardware 2.0 for our Play Blast, but we want to switch that over to Arnold for our render. And when we switch to Arnold, you'll notice we gain a tab here called AOVs. That's going to be our arbitrary output values, which are also more well known as our render passes. So let's expand that, and let's make this a bit bigger so we can see this. Over here, we have access to the various AOVs that we can utilize in our render, and this contains a bunch of information that we can access, such as ID maps or Z-depth, and we'll explore each of those. Now, let's start out with one of the most basic ones, which is going to be the color. If we scroll down here, we'll be able to find a section here called diffuse. Diffuse is the term used to describe the diffuse color, and you'll see that we have access to three different categories. We have diffuse direct, and we have diffuse indirect. The difference between these is that diffuse is direct and indirect combined. Now, just to start things off, let's add these. The way you add a AOV is you select it here and use these arrows here to move it over. So if I go ahead and just click that arrow, you'll see we now have access to diffuse. Notice my renderer starts again, and that's because we've made a change to the render settings and we have access to an AOV now. The way we can check our AOVs is in the drop-down menu over here. You'll see the top one is called Beauty. Beauty is the term we use to refer to all the AOVs combined, but if we go ahead and drop down that menu, you'll see the ones we've added, and you'll see diffuse. What diffuse is showing us here is the color channel of our shader and just the color channel and nothing else. So as we start to add these, we can add in various things that allow us to separate these, right? Now, let's go ahead and explore what diffuse direct and indirect look like. We can click on one and then shift click on another, and we can add those by moving them over. And you can see with diffuse direct, we have the direct light that's shining on the surface. And with diffuse indirect, we gain the bounce light that's coming from the ground. You'll see it's only affecting the character. Once again, diffuse is diffuse direct combined with diffuse indirect. So it's really just a matter of how much control you want to have. To keep this project simple, we'll just use the broad categories. If you want to move AOVs back, you can select them and you can move them back this way. Now you might be thinking, what's the point of moving them back? Isn't it best to have all of them? And you're partly correct in that respect, but when it comes to AOVs, you have to do separate renders for each of them, essentially. So having all of them is great. It gives you a lot of control, but it also makes it take forever to render. So we usually just want what we're going to use. So now that we have diffuse, we can think of the other channels we have access to, or need access to rather, and we can just look down the list. You'll see the next one here is emission, and we're using emission for the eyeballs, so I think we probably need emission. We can move that over. And if we check out emission, you'll see that emission actually shows up in a couple places. We have it showing up in the eyeball, but we also have it showing up in the sky. Now, that could be a little bit of a challenge. There are some solutions to that, but we're not going to use them on this project. Also notice we have some emission here. The sky's refractions are refracting emission. So what we're seeing in those corners is the actual sky. And if we were to frame forward to where he's lifting it up in the air, this would be even stronger. So emission's definitely an important one for us to have. Now, coming down here, we can explore a few more of these. We have specular. We definitely have specular in here, so we can move specular over. And if we take a look at the specular channel, you can see this is the result that we get here. This channel is going to be important in particular for getting some extra shine to this. And I might also lift up the brightness on the ground or maybe introduce an additional light just to add what we're seeing here in the viewport. I really like the waves we're getting here. And you can see that seen in the specular. So we might be able to adjust this to be a little bit stronger so we can see those in the beauty pass. Or we could use this in some other way, maybe to gain those. But you can see seeing the specular pass by itself is actually really neat. Moving down, we have things like subsurface scattering, which we didn't use. We have transmission. We can move that over. And if we go ahead and take a look at the transmission layer, you'll see we actually have none. Now, the reason why that's happening is I don't fully know. Transmission is one of those interesting things where by itself, you will have access to it, but it comes in the form of reflection. It comes in the form of specular. So there's not really a transmission here. So since we don't really have access to transmission, I'm not going to worry about it. That's going to be captured in our specular and our emission passes, since we're putting this inside of a scene. Moving down, I don't think there's anything else in here that we actually have in our base AOVs. So the beauty, the diffuse, the emission, and the specular are going to be the base AOVs we're going to utilize for the scene. So as a challenge, what I want you to do is go set up your diffuse, emission, and specular AOVs and save out your scene into a new file. We're going to come up to File, Save Scene As. We're going to navigate up to our Scenes folder, and I'm going to create a new folder here called Rendering. And I'm going to make this in all caps so I can find it. And we'll just go ahead and make this our Robot Animation 01 rendering file and save. And that will save all those AOV settings for us. All right. So once again, diffuse, emission, specular. Let's go ahead and start with those, and then we'll explore some additional channels that can be useful next when you come back from the challenge. All right, so coming back from the challenge, we're going to introduce a few additional useful channels. One is the ID map. If you move this over, the ID map assigns a random color identifier to everything in the scene, and this could be very useful for creating masks for selection and masking certain colors. So the ID mask is a neat one to have. We don't necessarily need the ID mask for our particular scene, but it could be useful to do things like remove the sky. You can see how the sky is completely black. And that would allow us to just do the emission for the eyes or for the gem, and we could do individual selections otherwise. So there's various tools that let us make selections by color, and the ID map is going to be a really cool tool to use for that. So you can try adding in the ID map. We might use that. Another really useful one here is this one called Z. Now, if you add Z over here to your maps, it's not going to look like it's doing anything. Z stands for something called Z depth, and that is the Z channel. A unique aspect of 2D images is that they are two-dimensional. They lack a third channel. They lack a Z channel. So adding this in can allow us to do artificial depth of field. Now, I don't know if we're going to use this, but we might experiment with it, and it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Now, if you would like to check this, you can use this gamma dial up here. Just note that 0 is the default. And if you move this around, you can see how it maps the depth of the scene using this. So that will allow us to use compositing software to use this as a depth map and assign aspects like blurs to it to make it so as things are further away, they're blurry, as things are closer up, they're crisp, or vice versa, or we can even animate it. So let's zero that out, and we'll leave that there. All right, so we went ahead and set up our base AOVs here for things like ID, Z-depth, diffuse, emission, and specular. What we're ready to do is set up a custom AOV of our own. So what we can do to add a custom AOV is first off, make ourselves more screen space. And we can add a custom AOV using the custom button. You'll see there is an add custom here. And the custom we're going to create is ambient occlusion. This is the most commonly created custom AOV. You might be wondering why it's not included in the browser here. The reason why is when you look at the browser, what it's showing you is additive mathematics, generally speaking. And when we deal with a ambient occlusion pass, it is a multiplicative mathematic. So it kind of operates in a separate math space, so to speak. So let's click that add custom. And we're going to name this AO and hit create. The name doesn't really matter. You can name it ambient occlusion if you wanted to, but we're just going to name that AO. Now, once you've created this, it's pretty simple to set up. We're going to have it selected here, and we're going to switch over to our attribute editor on our side screen. If you're still in the animation workspace, you might want to switch back to the classic view under Windows Workspace and General here. So let's go ahead and click that button. And what you'll see is we gain access to a special menu here for the AOVs. You can tell it's our AOV because the name here, AI AOV AO, and the name AO. Now, setting up our ambient occlusion shader is very easy. We're just going to assign a shader here to allow us to set this AOV up. You can click the file here to access your shader for this. This will open our file browser, and in this, we're going to search for an ambient occlusion shader. Now, if you type an AM in here, AMB, you'll notice that nothing comes up, but notice what we are searching. We're searching surface, volume, and displacement within Maya. We want to be searching Arnold. If you come down and you click on Arnold, you'll see it's going to search through Arnold here, and we have the ambient occlusion here that we can use. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this AI ambient occlusion shader, and we're going to click on it, and what this will do is it'll assign the shader to everything in the scene. That's all we need to do. We can go ahead and hit play now to re-render this. And if we come up here to our AOVs, we can access our AO AOV here, and you'll see that we now have ambient occlusion across this entire scene, which looks pretty nice. The default settings for the ambient occlusion are good enough. We could do a few things like increase the samples to be higher if we want a smoother result, but generally speaking, this is good enough for what we're going to do. Feel free to play around with it if you would like to adjust the quality further. But just be aware that this is going to be composited on top of everything else, so it's going to be a fairly subtle effect. But you can see some of the nice shadows. We're going to get various things like contact shadows here that will make a big difference in making this pop and look a little bit nicer.